Okay, we're ready to begin, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker who will start our session, who's also the co-convener of this seminar series, Martin Kauffmann, who's the head of Early and Rare Collections at the Bodleian Libraries.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone. And I hope if we could have the first slide on the screen. That's great, thank you. We're going to spend some time this afternoon looking at two not quite empty boxes recently acquired by the Bodleian and the John Rylands Libraries. My job is just quickly to set the scene. The acquisition of these caskets, or coffers, by the two libraries is not quite as much of a coincidence as it may appear. In 2007, the sale in Paris of the collection of over 20 of them, which had been formed by André and Marie-Thérèse Jamme, prompted renewed interest in this very particular type of object. Several were acquired by Professor Sandra Hindman and her colleagues at the Dealer Les Enluminures of Paris and New York, which was the immediate source for the Bodleian coffer. Monsieur Jamme had purchased it in Burgundy, where he believed that it had been since before the French Revolution, but we have no earlier provenance for it than that. Over 100 of these coffers survive. They're sometimes referred to as Gothic, and many of them seem like variations on a theme. An exhibition focusing on them was held at the Musée de Cluny in Paris from September 2019 to January 2020. They're made of wood, which, at least for those which have been tested, seems usually to be beech. The wood is covered with leather, which is sometimes tooled, with a metal lock, hinges and fittings, also sometimes decorated. The shapes vary. The lids can be domed or flat. Some have secret locking mechanisms and/or a secret compartment. The interior is sometimes lined with red or green linen or canvas, and sometimes includes a characteristic horsehair cushion. Some of the coffers have loops or bands on their sides, through which leather straps could be passed for them to be used as carrying cases. The Bodleian coffer is one of the largest at 32 centimeters long by 21.5 centimeters wide and 14 centimeters deep, and seems too big to have been flung over the shoulder or attached to a belt at the waist, but it might still have been strapped to luggage or looped over a saddle. The iron strips were for protection during travel. The coffers are not generally robust enough to have been used as strong boxes. Attached to the inside of the lid of the Bodleian coffer is a woodcut, one of about 4 known impressions depicting God the Father in majesty, with the text of a liturgical chant for the Feast of the Trinity. The print is derived from a design by an artist known as the master of the Très Petite Heure of Anne of Brittany, after a manuscript today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, who's perhaps to be identified as Jean d'Ypres or John of Ypres. The design was first used for a missal printed in Paris by Jean Dupré in 1491. Many, but not all, of the surviving coffers feature prints in this position. Most of the prints are religious in subject and were produced in Paris in the period about 1480 to 1530, which helps to date and localize the production of the coffers themselves. Several of the prints are by the same artist as ours. The prints were not made to measure. I hope that Ed Potten will speak more about these prints in relation to the John Rylands coffer a little later on. Their presence provides important in situ evidence for the use of such prints as single sheets. If we could have the next slide now. Sandra Hindman published a painting, now in private ownership, of the Rest on the Flight into Egypt, produced around 1530 in Antwerp. We reproduced it as the backdrop to a display of the coffer alongside a small selection of other book boxes in the Bodleian. The painting depicts just such a coffer, partially opened to reveal a small leather-bound book with clasps, as well as a rosary and other small objects. At least one other depiction of a coffer in a near-contemporary painting has come to light. Together, these scraps of evidence have lent support to the long-held view of the coffers as travelling book boxes, or perhaps more generally, as the carriers of a sort of portable devotional toolkit. But other suggested uses have included the carrying of money, of documents, or of medicines. I hope that serves as enough of an introduction. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Andrew Honey, who's going to show the Bodleian coffer in greater detail. He's better qualified to do so than I am on at least 2 counts. He's a hands-on conservator and a contributor to the block book section in the Bodleian's catalogue of incunables. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Martin. And you've given such a wonderful introduction to our coffer that there's little more for me to say really than to perhaps go through some of its features in slightly greater detail. I'd like to start by showing you one of the 2 3D models that we had made of the coffer for our 2019 display. So I'm just going to share my screen. So this is one of the 2 models that was made with photogrammetry by the Oxford Internet Institute for us. And it allows us, allows a viewer to rotate and play with and sort of investigate the coffer in greater detail. And to give you a sense of it as a 3-dimensional object, which I hope is what will come out this afternoon. So just to, and we had 2 of these made, one with the lid open, and you can do a rather whizzy thing which looks through the base of it towards the print, but it gives you a sense of the textile lining. And then there is another 3D model of it that has been made with the lid closed, and that allows you to see the base of the coffer. And our thanks to Jamie Cameron and Sarah Griffin of the Oxford Internet Institute for doing this. And it's been mounted on Cabinet, which was a trial project to make digital resources more easily available for teaching and research within Oxford. So could we go back to the slideshow, please, Steph? Thank you. So having shown you the model, and to give you an idea of it kind of rotating in space, and I think Alex will put up the links to where you can be, it can be found on our website later. You can all go away and play with it. I'd like to use the rest of this short presentation to focus more closely on certain features of our new coffer. It's interesting, my sizes are ever so slightly different to Martin's sizes. So I'm going to say it's 34 by 22 by 14 centimeters, or about the size and shape of a large shoebox. and it weighs some 1.7 kilograms, which Google informs me is about the weight of a pair of women's shoes. It's made from wood, covered in leather, and lined with red canvas. And as you've seen, it's bound with iron strips and has a lock mechanism at the front. The lid of the coffer is hinged on the short back wall, and there is a print pasted inside the lid, orientated so it is meant to be viewed from the front, i.e. the side with the lock, and it's meant to be viewed with the lid lifted. Could I have the next slide? The print is a single sheet woodcut, hand coloured using stencils with 5 colours. The paper's at least 266 by 200 millimetres, and the block is at least 248 millimetres high by 164 millimetres wide, and it's partly obscured. As Martin said, the woodcut depicts God the Father in majesty, flanked by angels and with evangelists in the corners, all above 3 lines of xylographic text, and all have been printed from a single block. Next slide, please. There are 5 known impressions of this print, including one in another coffer that is now at the New York Public Library. Karl Kapp published that one in 1957, where he noted that the print was based on a woodcut used in the Verdun Missal, printed in Paris by Jean de Pré, and now dated to 1491. And that's what we see on the left here. The reworked woodcut retains the central image, but without the border, and adds the 3 lines of xylographic text. And just to note that these 2 prints are not shown at the same scale here, but it's worth noting that the Verdun Missal's format is folio, and it is one of the Missal's 2 full-page woodcuts. Next slide, please. The woodcut used in the coffer retains the same overall proportions as that used in the Verdun Missal. This is achieved by compressing and flattening the composition. The upper evangelists, Matthew and John, are lowered to eliminate space between them and the flanking angels. And I'm showing you how this might be done in the highlighted orange bits. While Luke and Mark are moved up onto the podium. This allows the top and bottom of the design to be cropped. The resulting print, the image and the 3 lines of text retains the proportions of the source woodcut, a folio page. Therefore, the woodcut and our coffer have the proportions of a folio format book. Next slide, please. At first sight, the coffer looks an impressive, impenetrable object, extensively bound with iron bands and with this lock mechanism at the front. And originally with 5 hinges at the back, 3 corresponding to the central part of the shaped lid. However, it's not a secure, strong box. It's only the hasp and hinges that pass over the join between the base and lid, and it would be relatively easy to break into it. Next slide, please. The base of our coffer is now exposed and shows that it was made from 2 thin boards of beechwood, again indicating that it's not built for strength. And note that the iron bands do not encircle the entire coffer. The base is relatively clean, and we can see that the dark, thin leather that covers the walls and lid has been roughly turned in and pasted to the edge of the base. Next slide. Thank you. On each of the 2 long side walls, there are the 2 metal loops that would have accommodated a shoulder strap, probably made from leather, but again, none of these shoulder straps survive. At the base of each of the walls, there are the remains of a lighter brown leather held in place by a row of nails. Can be seen here. From other coffers, we know that these are the edges of a larger piece of leather in a contrasting colour that would have covered the entire base, but would not have been stuck to it, allowing it to be stuffed with straw or horsehair. This created a padded cushion. The strap allowed the coffer to be carried like a bag, and the cushion would have made it more comfortable. However, as I've said, it's not a sturdy structure, and one wonders if it was carried either far or often. Next slide, please. There are no wear patterns within our coffer, which might have indicated that it was used to store or carry a specific object over a long period. However, there is evidence of much repair, potentially carried out at an early period, which may indicate that the coffer was used and prized for many years. Next slide, please. The original central band, which flared to become the hinge of the lock hasp, has broken at the edge of the lid, and a replacement two-part wrought iron hasp has been nailed to one side of it. And at the back of the lid, here at the bottom of the slide, 3 bands, including 2 which were part of the original hinges, are now broken and shortened. One replacement hinge has been added, and we can see that a new strip of leather has been added to hide some of this repair work. Next slide, please. And likewise, there is evidence of repairs that can be seen on the inner face of the lid. There are 2 splits in the wooden carcass and a loose rectangular piece towards the bottom of the lid, all now secured by 6 nails driven through the print. Though interestingly, only one of these nails can be seen to pass entirely through the lid to the outside. And the fact that they go through the print makes you think that it must have been done at an early period. These are hand-wrought nails with faceted heads and appear to be early. There are also 2 extra pieces of wood added to the short ends of the lid at the top and bottom of our print. These have been nailed to the lid over the print, hence my difficulty in measuring it, and were probably put on to stabilize it. Next slide, please. So following our early 2019 Bodleian display, the coffer was boxed and moved to the stack, and Martin and I moved on to other things. However, our understanding of it has been greatly expanded by the exhibition held at the Cluny Museum from late 2019 to 2020. And it has a fantastic catalogue. This has allowed us to begin to compare it with the wider corpus of surviving coffers with prints and to appreciate their particular characteristics. To conclude, I will show a couple of details from other coffers that are helping us to understand ours. So these coffers have been divided into 2 main types by the shape of their lids, in French, bombé or talute. That is, either with a curved or a sloping or stepped lid. Ours being talute, the type on the right. The example on the left has a dogleg shaped lock hasp, hinged in the center of the lid, but closing into an off-center lock, probably similar to our lost hasp, and that will become important in a moment. Next slide, please. More excitingly, the catalogue explains the purpose of the talute or stepped lid, a method of providing a concealed shallow compartment within the coffer. The central part of the lid hinged separately and could be permanently closed and secured with a nail. This nail was in turn covered by the lock hasp. Next slide, please. So with this new information, and in preparation for this session, I've gone back to our photos, particularly trying to understand what the later repairs might obscure. My eye has been drawn to an exposed edge of wood, half covered by one of the iron bands that runs from the front of the lid to the back. The corresponding area on the other side of the lid is obscured by the repair leather. This confirms that ours also has this concealed compartment. The later repairs, nails, and the 2 additional pieces of wood on the inside of the lid mean that it is permanently sealed now, and it's not at all obvious at first sight. Next slide, please. So far, no coffer has been found with the original contents of this concealed compartment remaining. Next slide, please. And fundamental questions remain to be answered about the production, function, and use of these intriguing coffers. You will notice that ours retains its closing nail and doesn't appear to have been removed at any point. And its compartment has been additionally secured by the nails from the repairs. We hope to investigate it further when things return to normal. I'm itching to get my hands on it, and perhaps it will yield further surprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew Honey at the Bodleian Library. And we're now going to go virtually to the John Rylands Library to hear about a coffer there. And the presenters we have from the John Rylands, Julianne Simpson, who is now Research Engagement Manager for the University of Manchester Library Special Collections, and previously Rare Books and Maps Manager since 2010 at the John Rylands Library. And Ed Potten, who's currently a Research Associate at the Centre for Medieval Studies at York University and in the Department of History at Durham University, and was previously responsible for Rare Books at the John Rylands Library and Head of Rare Books at the Cambridge University Library. He's also Vice President of the Bibliographical Society. Julianne Simpson and Ed Potten have a display of the coffer in live action with Ed speaking, I think, but Julianne might explain to us where she is and what she has to share.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I'm in the John Rylands Library today. I'm lucky enough to still have some limited access, especially on Mondays, which is fortuitous for normally for teaching an MA course, which is on hiatus for a couple of weeks. So we have a setup here for teaching, and we're hoping now to show you both our new coffer and also another example of already in the collection of a print in situ in a slightly different context. But Ed is going to actually speak while I'll turn off my video and share the view of the coffer for you. So I'm just going to do that.
Okay, so hopefully, here we go, the screen sharing's getting going.
Yeah, the camera switched itself off, so apologies for the...
Well, while that's resetting itself, we should probably start by saying that, unfortunately, we know considerably less about the Rylands coffer at the moment than Martin and Andrew do about the Bodleian one. So this was acquired by the Rylands Library in February 2020. We had an ambitious programme of research and engagement and conservation, which was due to begin on it. But in March, COVID-19 rather put a stop to our plans. And actually, this is the first time I've seen it since February 2020. So it's a very nice opportunity to see it again. We should apologise too at the outset. There may be a little bit of repetition in what I'm about to say from what Martin said and what Andrew's already said. Working remotely, it's been a bit more complicated to get all of this to dovetail together quite as it might do. So apologies for that. And hopefully through the miracle of modern technology, we're going to get an opportunity to actually see one of these things and have that moment of revelation when the box opens and you actually see the print in situ, which I think is really central and really critical to understanding how these objects work. So what I'm going to do is we're going to show you the coffer that we bought last year. We've got a couple of additional items from the Rylands collections, which if there's time, we might also show you to give you a bit of context. And while Julianne is showing them, I'm really just going to talk a little bit about what we do know about the Rylands coffer, about some of the research questions which these sorts of objects raise, and I think also about some of the problems that we face when we're trying to study prints in context in the 15th and 16th centuries. So although we haven't been able to delve terribly deeply as yet, we do nevertheless know a reasonable amount about our Gothic coffer. It's wooden, and again, it's presumably beech, although we haven't done the tests to confirm that. It's covered with leather. The cover is reinforced with 9 iron fittings. It has hinges and a lock. The sides, as in the Bodleian example, have hoops, which we assume were for a carrying strap. Unlike the Bodleian example, the interior of ours is not lined, although it may once have been lined. But in common with most of them, the lock mechanism is clearly exposed. So I think the first thing to observe about this one is that the Rylands coffer is of a different type to that at the Bodleian. So Andrew's already mentioned that these boxes fall into 2 distinct groups, those with the flat lids and those with the domed lids. And the Rylands example is one of these domed examples. So there is no secret compartment in the Rylands example, alas, but it is a nice contrast to the one that you've already seen because it's the other type. So like 90% of the surviving corpus of these, and as Martin mentioned, we think there are about 110 boxes surviving today. The Rylands box contains a devotional woodcut. So I might give Julianne an opportunity just to open this up so you can see. So in the Rylands coffer, there is a woodcut depicting the monogram of Christ, IHS, and a crucifix forming the left stem of the H is accompanied by images of the instruments of the Passion and by 2 monks who are kneeling before a Eucharistic chalice. And again, like the majority of surviving examples, the woodcut's hand-coloured with orange, red and blue, green, and the colours are, like Andrew said, these are applied with a stencil. So although the boxes are broadly homogeneous, the prints that we find inside them are much less so. Of the 110 coffers, Gothic coffers that survive, more than half contain impressions of woodcuts which can be attributed to a single Parisian workshop, the studio of the master of the very small hours of Anne of Brittany, now identified as the artist Jean Dipre. Where the coffers contain impressions which we think were from different workshops, what we can say about them is that they're still undoubtedly Parisian. And all of them seem to have been produced in this quite narrow chronological period between about 1480 and 1530, 1540. So the master of the very small hours was a multimedia artist. So he was responsible for painted altarpieces, for stained glass windows, for designs for tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and designs like this one, which is a wee bit out of focus. Julianne, can we?
I know, I'm trying.
Yeah.
Keep talking. I'll get it back into focus at some point.
And woodcuts like these ones. And we think because of the volume and diversity of woodcuts that survive associated with this individual, that it is actually a workshop, not an individual. So these are all drawn together stylistically. Studying single leaf wood and metal cuts in this period is a real uphill struggle for a number of reasons. First of all, the corpus of surviving woodcuts is tiny. Richard Field has suggested that there are impressions from around 5,000 woodblocks surviving today from the 15th century, and around 90% of those are known to survive in just a single instance. So Richard's conservative estimate is that we may have lost over 500,000 impressions from those 5,000 blocks in the ensuing years. And of course, those calculations don't include all of the many, many blocks which are wholly lost to us. So impressions which just don't survive at all. So the corpus that we have to infer from in this period is tiny, and it only represents the tip of the iceberg in terms of what was there. The second great problem that we face when trying to understand these things is that those prints which have survived tend to have been removed from their original context. So from the 18th century onwards, print collectors hoovered up prints from the 15th and 16th century wherever they found them, and they had a very happy hunting ground when the monastic collections were dispersed at the beginning of the 19th century. Unlike contemporary book collectors in the 19th century, who like their incunabula to be clean and tall and crisp, rebound in red Morocco, print collectors tended to like their prints neatly mounted into albums rather than pasted onto pieces of furniture or pinned to walls. So as a consequence, prints tend to have been removed from the original places where they were found. And in this systematic removal of their contexts, we've often lost the only evidence that we have which would allow us to date or localize those prints. And what we've definitely lost is the contextual information we need to understand their contemporary use. And this, I think, is where these coffers are so important. Because of the nature of the coffers and the very intimate linkage between the woodcut and the print, and Andrew's already noted, lots of these actually have nails that physically go through the woodcut, so they're not easy to remove. But because of these, they represent a very rare opportunity to study a corpus of woodcut images still in the context in which they were originally used. And this, I think, is presumably the reason why both the Bodleian and the Rylands acquired these coffers. So the Rylands Sacred Monogram woodcut has actually survived. It's fared better than most of these single sheet woodcuts. That's known in 13 impressions. So there are 13 instances of it that survive. The Rylands was fortunate in having the opportunity to acquire not just the coffer itself, but simultaneously to also acquire 2 impressions that had been removed from coffers at some point, probably in the 19th century. One of which was a second impression of the sacred monogram woodcut. The other, which Julianne might be able to show you in a minute, is an impression which was also from a coffer lid. It's unfortunately quite badly damaged, but it's an impression of the Virgin and Infant Christ with the signs of the sun and the moon encircled by a rosary. And this is from the same workshop, and we think that there are 6 examples of impressions of this block surviving. So placing the prints alongside the box gives us the opportunity to compare identical impressions. And it does potentially cast a bit of light on the production of these objects. There's been much debate about whether boxes and woodcuts were produced by a single workshop or whether they were the result of a fortuitous meeting between 2 workshops, one making the boxes and the other making the prints. And you can see from the Rylands Sacred Monogram woodcut that the impression in the box has been quite crudely trimmed down to fit the space which is available. And this is a feature which we commonly see across these coffret. This does kind of suggest that the woodcuts were unlikely to have been made specifically for the boxes. You would imagine that if it was being done in one workshop, some very basic measuring would have been done to make sure that print fitted box. So it does seem to indicate that the prints are being produced for a variety of purposes. So to be pasted into books, to be pinned on walls, and some of them end up being used within these coffers. The correspondence, though, between woodcuts from this particular workshop appearing in coffers does indicate that this is a production line process rather, I think, than the chance that people are buying woodcuts and pasting them in as a personal preference. So even with such a relatively large corpus to study, 110 boxes, they are still very mysterious objects, and I think they raise as many questions as potentially they answer. So scholars are still debating their use, whether they held relics, whether they hold books, whether they held books and relics or something different entirely. But studies do strongly suggest that they're most likely to have been book boxes. Severin Lepat notes that they're unusual amongst medieval furnishings in that they're longer than they are wide. And they do seem, when you look at them, ideally suited to carry a book-shaped object.
Can I butt in there, Ed?
Yes, you can.
So at this point, as we were talking about this morning, I found myself a contemporary Parisian Book of Hours, I think from Tilman Curver from 1498, just to see if it would it would fit, and it does.
So maybe the first time a book of hours has been in that box since God knows when, but so I guess the religious nature of so many of these woodcuts, so 90% of the woodcuts that survive inside coffers are of a devotional nature. And again, the very strong focus amongst those of things like the instruments of the Passion, the suffering of Christ, does strongly suggest too that these boxes were for devotional use. And when Julianne opened it up, as I say, I think we get this impression of, it's almost like a private altar, that you can open it up and you have that moment of revelation when you see the woodcut in place. The presence of the secret compartments, which were perhaps intended for consecrating relics, also supports the idea that these are primarily devotional, transportation boxes. And I think they do fit, this combination of box and print does fit very nicely with our growing understanding of changes in patterns in devotion in this period. So the move away from public devotion towards private devotion, the increased use and production of personalized devotional books. It's worth remembering, these boxes are made at exactly the same time that printers like Jean Dupré and Pierre Larouge are moving seriously into the production of printed books of hours. Then you've got, the increased centrality of wood and metal cut images as focuses of devotion. And one can very easily imagine one of these little books of hours, like the one that Julianne's got out for us, kept in a locked box and used for private study and private devotion. Martin mentioned earlier on Sandra Heinemann's article in 2015, which revealed this amazing Northern Renaissance image of a book box in use. And that again adds support to this. In that painting, you can see the partially opened box, and it contains a small leather-bound clasped book, amongst other things, on a sort of plush white linen cushion. So I think we are fairly sure what they're for. So what these things demonstrate, I think, is how important having the print in the context is. And Julianne thought, and I thought it might be interesting to compare it very briefly with another example from the Rylands collection, the survival of two really extraordinary prints in a rather different context. So this is the famous Rylands St. Christopher woodcut, which for a long time was thought to be the earliest dated Western woodcut, because you can just see at the bottom there, it bears a xylographic date of 1423. But it's not the date we really wanted to talk about today. It's more we wanted to use this as an example, another example of a print or a set of prints in a different context, and to show that even where we do have this supporting context, it isn't always as clear cut as it appears to be, and that even these single leaves could have multiple lives and multiple uses at different times. So one of the commonest uses of woodcuts in the 15th century was to be pasted into books and manuscripts. So either as devotional aids or as mementos to be exchanged, or simply as a way of preserving useful content. So it is a practice that we find among private book owners, but we particularly associate it with monastic houses. So the St. Christopher and its companion woodcut, which Julianne might be able to show you a little bit later on, are pasted onto the front and rear boards of a manuscript of the Laus Mariae, which according to its colophon was completed in 1417. So there was in the 18th century an inscription on a front flyleaf of this manuscript, which has subsequently been lost, unfortunately, which records that the manuscript was given to the library of the Charterhouse at Buxheim by a woman called Anna von Gundenfilgen, who was a canoness at nearby Buchau. So we know that this manuscript was in the library at Buxheim by 1450, because it's in the library catalogue there. And we know that it must have been given by Anna somewhere between 1430, when she was appointed as canoness, and 1442, when she died. So even if one credits the date of 1423 on the woodcut as correct, what's clear is that both prints and manuscript had a life separate before they were brought together. And there's some clear physical evidence to support this, although it's going to be very difficult to see here. The St. Christopher has tiny pinholes in each corner of the woodcut. And similar pinholes have been identified by Andrew and Nigel Palmer in one of the Dowse block books at the Bodleian. And in both instances, what we think is that this is evidence that the woodcuts as sheets were originally pinned to a wall or pinned to a piece of furniture. So what we can say with some confidence is that this isn't the first place that the Rylands St. Christopher ended up posted. So because of the vexing date of the a vexing question around the dating of these two impressions, we've long suspected that actually they date from the 1430s or 1440s rather than the 1420s. There's been a particular focus in this instance on trying to establish when the prints were brought together with the manuscript in which they now live. So the idea here is that if you could prove that they were in place when the book was given by Anna to Buxheim, then that might support an earlier date for the impressions. If it looks like they were put in after it came to Buxheim, that might support a later date for the impression. So to cut a very, very long story very, very short, the answer is that frustratingly, we just can't tell when these woodcuts were pasted into the manuscript, other than it was in the mid-century in the 15th century. There's writing which you could see. Julianne, do you think we could just flick briefly back to St. Christopher? If you look closely, you can see that there's writing underneath the left-hand side, which re-emerges on the right-hand side. And this writing overlaps the turn-ins on the binding. So something was written on that paste down after the book was bound, but before it had the woodcut pasted onto it. And then you can see on the facing leaf, there is this intriguing, lengthy inscription, which is essentially, it records the beneficial properties of a series of precious stones. And it concludes with a prayer for the consecration of an Agnus Dei, so an image of the model or of the Lamb of God, which was supposed to have talismanic qualities to keep you healthy. And because of this connection with the St. Christopher, which was a talismanic woodcut that you were supposed to offer your devotions to each day on the understanding that if you did so, you would remain healthy that day. It's long been thought that the inscriptions relate to the woodcut, and so the two things should be dated together. But unfortunately, paleography isn't a sophisticated enough tool to be able to pin a date to that. So anyway, to conclude, this is another fantastic example of a 15th century print which bears evidence of not one, but two different uses in a relatively short space of time, in a decade or two after its production, which is still in a 15th century context 500 years later, and where that context is simultaneously critical to our understanding of it, but where annoyingly it actually raises as many questions having it in context as it potentially answers. And I think the same is probably true for the coffers. Thank you.